30 minutes, my VP said, loud enough to carry across every open desk on the 14th floor. Gather your things and go, Daniel. We're done here. I set down my coffee. Not because I was startled. Because I wanted a second to look at her clearly, to remember exactly how she looked in this moment, chin lifted, arms folded across her chest, the particular kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes but performs very well for an audience. And she had an audience. Every analyst, every junior associate, every assistant who'd been pretending to type while actually holding their breath, they were all watching now. 47 people. I know the head count because I approved every single hire from this floor over the past 6 years. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 32 years old, and the woman standing at my desk, speaking to me like I was a vending machine that had swallowed her dollar, had been with this company for 11 months. I nodded once. Understood. She seemed almost disappointed by that. Like she'd expected tears, or an argument, or at minimum a trembling voice. She leaned against the edge of my desk with the comfort of someone who believed she owned the room. I'll need your access card before you leave, she said. Of course. I reached into my drawer. I took my notebook, my pen, a small framed photo of my brother, and a charger. What I did not take was the other thing in that drawer, a flat metal key, unremarkable looking, the kind that opens a safety deposit box. I slid that into my jacket pocket instead, beneath her notice. I stood, straightened my jacket, and picked up my bag. Not one person on that floor said a word. Not my assistant, who'd worked beside me for 4 years. Not the senior analyst I'd personally mentored through 2 promotions. Not a single voice. I walked to the elevator and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. I exhaled slowly, watching my own reflection in the polished metal. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove 12 blocks south to a building most people at the firm didn't know existed, a small suite on the 9th floor of a mixed-use building on Wabash, registered under a holding name that had never appeared on any of our company's public documentation. I'd been using it as a private office for the better part of a year, nothing fancy. A desk, a secure filing cabinet, 2 monitors, and a lock on the door that answered only to me. I sat down, opened my laptop, and stared for a moment at the wallpaper, a photo of me and my brother at Soldier Field, maybe 8 years ago, both of us laughing at something I can't even remember anymore. He passed away 2 winters back. Lung cancer, fast and merciless. He was 39. He was the reason I started Hargrove Meridian Capital in the first place. He believed, with the kind of faith that embarrasses you when you're young and think you're being practical, that I would build something worth leaving behind. I spent the first 4 years making sure he was right. Then I spent the last 3 watching someone I trusted try to erase me from it quietly. I opened the folder labeled simply Exit Protocol. Inside were 14 months of work, emails with timestamps, signed transfer documents, board meeting minutes with key passages highlighted, a full chain of custody showing how my former partner, the man I'd built this company with from a shared apartment in Wicker Park, had systematically diluted my voting power through a series of restructuring votes. I was never properly notified about, all while I was managing my brother's final months of care. He hadn't just pushed me aside. He'd done it while I was sitting in a hospital waiting room. I'd found out 6 weeks after my brother's funeral, when a routine review of our cap table showed numbers that didn't match what I remembered signing. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a single aggressive email. I called my attorney, forwarded him everything, and started keeping records. The filing cabinet beside my desk held 3 binders. 2 were documentation. One was something more specific, a collection of communications between my former partner and the VP, going back to her first week at the firm. She hadn't been a surprise hire. She had been a deliberate appointment, someone he trusted to manage my removal while he stayed clean. Every performance critique she'd filed against me, every manufactured HR note, every quiet conversation with board members designed to seed doubt, I had a copy of all of it. I'd also spent the past 3 months speaking privately with 2 of our board members, both of whom had been growing uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. I'd shared enough with them to earn their attention. Tonight I'd share the rest. I sent 2 emails. The first to my attorney. The second to Olivia Park, our most senior independent board member and a former federal prosecutor, with the subject line, "Ready to proceed." Her reply came in 4 minutes. "Tomorrow morning. I'll handle the rest." I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet settle around me. By the time I walked through the lobby of our Michigan Avenue office the next morning, it was 8:52. I wore a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this occasion, months ago, and hung in the closet ever since. I looked, I think, like a man who had somewhere to be and no particular anxiety about getting there. The security guard at the front desk looked up, recognized me, and reached immediately for the phone. I smiled at him, a real one, because none of this was his fault. The elevator opened on 14. I stepped out and walked calmly to the center of the floor. She was coming out of the glass-walled conference room with a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other, mid-conversation with someone from accounting. She saw me and stopped talking entirely. Daniel. The way she said my name had changed already. There was a thin note of uncertainty underneath the performance, like a piano key that's slightly out of tune. "Good morning," I said. Before she could find the next sentence, Olivia appeared from the side corridor with Thomas Reed, our longest-tenured board member. Beside her, Olivia had the kind of bearing that made rooms adjust themselves around her. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. "Miss Sutton," Olivia said, "we'll need you to surrender your company-issued devices. Effective as of this moment, your position is under suspension pending a formal review." The color left her face in stages. "On what grounds?" she said. Not a question, exactly. More like something she said because silence felt worse. Thomas nodded toward me. "Mr. Hargrove has initiated a founder review under Section 9 of our operating agreement. The board convened at 7 this morning. The suspension is unanimous." She looked at me like she was trying to find something to hold on to. "You can't just—" "I've already filed the documentation," I said. "My attorney has copies. So does every board member. So does the SEC regional office. As of 45 minutes ago." She opened her mouth again. Nothing came out. "Someone from HR will walk you through the process," Olivia said, gently but with complete finality. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stepped around her and took the elevator to the top floor. The executive suite was quiet in the way that only happens when everyone in it knows something is wrong. My former partner's assistant stood when she saw me, her expression caught between professional neutrality and visible alarm. "He's expecting someone," she said carefully. "He's expecting me?" I said. "Just not this soon." I pushed open the glass door. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, phone to his ear. The Chicago skyline spread out behind him, and I remembered, briefly and without sentiment, that I had chosen this office for its view. I'd been the one who signed the lease. He turned when he heard the door. The call dropped, or he ended it, I'm not sure which. He stared at me for a moment with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not quite fear, something older than fear. The look of a man recognizing the specific moment that everything stops. "Daniel." He said my name the same way she had. I set my leather portfolio on the corner of his desk without sitting down. "Inside that folder," I said, "you'll find copies of every board meeting you scheduled while I was in Evanston with my brother. You'll find the 3 restructuring votes that reduced my stake from 61% to below the threshold needed for founder override. You'll find the emails between you and the VP, including the one from last April where you used the phrase clean exit strategy to describe what you were building around me." I paused. "You'll also find the consulting agreement you signed with Dunmore Advisory Group in my name, while I was unreachable, without authorization, and billed to a project I was never informed existed." He set his phone face down on the desk. A deliberate gesture. "Buying time." "That's not how it happened," he said. "You signed those documents during my brother's final week of hospice care," I said quietly. "I have the timestamps. I have your signature. I have the notary stamp." Something moved across his face, not remorse. Exactly. Something smaller and more cornered. "I built this company too," he said. "Everything we have. I know what you built." I was there. I looked at him steadily. "But you weren't there when I needed $60,000 to keep the lights on in year 2 and I refinanced my apartment to get it. You weren't there when the Henderson deal fell through and I stayed up for 3 days rebuilding the pitch from scratch. You were there for the wins and I was grateful for that. I thought you deserved every one of them." I stopped. "Then I thought you'd at least have the decency to wait until my brother was buried before you moved against me." He said nothing. "The board has everything," I said. "My attorney is filing the full complaint this afternoon. If you leave the building quietly and cooperate with the review, that's between you and your lawyers. If you make this ugly, I have considerably more." He sat down, then heavily, like the air had gone out of him. I watched him age about 10 years in the space of a breath. I turned to leave, and then I noticed something on the floor beside the credenza. A cardboard box, half-packed with framed photos and desk accessories. He'd already started packing. Not because he knew I was coming, but because he'd known, somewhere in himself, that this day existed. I left the office without another word. The boardroom was on 17, 1 floor above the executive suite, and when I walked in 20 minutes later, the full board had gathered. 8 people. 2 of them I'd spoken with privately over the past weeks. The rest were learning, in real time, the extent of what had been happening in their own company. I didn't perform. I didn't build to a crescendo. I laid the documents on the table, walked through the timeline clearly, and answered every question as directly as I could. I presented the consulting fraud. I presented the voting irregularities. I presented the paper trail of the VP's role as an instrument of my removal, fully coordinated and documented from her first week. When I finished, the room was very still. Olivia spoke first. "You had all of this," she said, "and you waited 14 months. I wanted to be certain," I said, "and I wanted it to be undeniable." She looked at the table for a moment. Then she nodded. Thomas cleared his throat. "We owe you an apology, Daniel. Several of us should have asked harder questions much earlier." "I appreciate that," I said. And I meant it, even though it didn't change anything that had already happened. The vote was brief. Founder reinstatement unanimous. External audit authorized unanimous. Referral to our compliance committee for review of all transactions from the past 18 months unanimous. I was named interim CEO pending the completion of the audit. I stayed in the boardroom for a while after the others filed out, sitting alone at the long mahogany table. The view from 17 was wider than from 15. You could see all the way to the lake on a clear day, and it was clear that morning. I thought about my brother. I thought about the apartment in Wicker Park where we'd written the original business plan on a whiteboard we'd found at a garage sale. I thought about the specific version of this company that existed in my head back then, not just profitable, but worth something. Built on something that mattered. I was going to have to rebuild a lot of the middle layer, the department heads and senior staff who had organized themselves around the assumption that I was gone for good. That would take time. But the foundation was still there. The foundation had always been there. On my way back to my office, I passed the VP being escorted to the elevator by 2 people from HR. She had a box in her hands. She didn't look at me as I passed, and I didn't stop walking. There was one more thing. The auditors, when they started reviewing the books the following week, were the ones who found it first. I'd suspected something was there, but I hadn't had access to the full financial records yet. A series of wire transfers over 8 months, routed through a subsidiary we'd set up for a partnership deal in Phoenix 3 years back. The amounts were irregular, not large enough to trip automated alerts, but consistent and directional. When you mapped the destination accounts, they resolved to a consulting LLC registered in Delaware under a name with no web presence and a single listed member. That member was a personal acquaintance of my former partner. Someone he'd known since graduate school. The total, across all transfers, was just under $2 million. I sat with my attorney and our forensic accountant in the Wabash office for 2 hours that afternoon, going through every transaction line by line. It wasn't glamorous work. It was slow and careful and occasionally maddening. But that kind of patience had always been my strongest asset. My brother used to joke that I was constitutionally incapable of panic. "You could be on fire," he'd say, "and you'd still want to finish the paragraph." By 5 o'clock, the referral package was ready. My attorney overnighted it to the U.S. Attorney's office with a cover letter and a full exhibit set. That evening, I drove home to my apartment in Lincoln Park, poured myself a glass of water, and stood on the balcony for a long time. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that midweek evenings in early fall tend to be. Porch lights on, a few dog walkers, the distant sound of a train. I thought about all the nights over the past 14 months when I'd sat in the Wabash office after dark, building the case piece by piece, knowing that if I moved too soon or got anything wrong, I'd lose my ability to fix it at all. There had been a particular kind of loneliness to that work. Not because I was alone. My attorney had been invaluable, and Olivia had become a quiet but steady ally once I'd brought her into my confidence. But because there are some things you can only carry yourself, and the weight of watching something you built get taken apart by someone you trusted is one of them. I'd been angry for a long time. I'd moved through that anger carefully, using it as fuel without letting it become direction. Anger is a terrible navigator, but properly contained, it is extraordinary energy. My phone buzzed on the balcony railing. Unknown number. I picked it up. The message read, "You think this ends with a board vote, Daniel? You have no idea what's still coming." I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked out at the street below. It was theatrical. Desperate in the specific way that people become desperate when they realize that the story they thought they were controlling has been telling itself without them. I recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone trying to create uncertainty in someone else because their own certainty had just been destroyed. I wasn't afraid. I had been prepared for something like this since month 3 of putting the file together. You don't spend 14 months documenting fraud without accepting that the people you're documenting will not be gracious about it. I went back inside. I made dinner. I called my mother, who lives in Naperville now, and talked to her for 40 minutes about nothing in particular: the garden she's been working on, a book she'd been reading, whether I was eating enough. She didn't know what had happened today. I would tell her soon. But not tonight. That night I slept better than I had in over a year. The press story broke 3 days later, not through a leak but through a formal statement that Olivia released on behalf of the board. It was measured and factual, the way she did everything. It named the fraud. It named the audit. It confirmed my reinstatement. It did not editorialize. But the financial press did. By noon, the story had been picked up by 4 major outlets. By 3 o'clock, it was trending in business circles on every major platform. I spent most of that day in meetings, because a reinstatement is not a finish line, it's a starting gun. There were vendor relationships to stabilize and employee questions to answer and a communication strategy to execute carefully so that our clients understood the company was not in chaos, that the governance issues had been contained and corrected, that the firm they'd trusted their capital with was still standing and intended to keep standing. I was in a meeting with our head of investor relations when my assistant knocked and handed me a note. 2 words, he called. My former partner. From a lawyer's office, through a lawyer, but still. The message was that he wanted to discuss terms. I passed the note back. Tell his attorney to speak with mine. It was not, I want to be clear, a satisfying moment in the cinematic sense. There was no surge of triumph. There was only the quiet sense of proportion returning to something that had been badly skewed, of a line being drawn in the right place after a long time in the wrong one. Later that afternoon, I walked back onto the 14th floor for the first time since the morning she had fired me. The floor had changed in the months I'd been kept out of it, different layout, a few new faces, some of the furniture rearranged into the configuration preferred by my former partner, who had a different sense of spatial hierarchy than I did. But the bones were the same. The bones I'd chosen. I didn't make a speech. I just walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at one of the open tables by the window. Gradually, as people registered that I was there and apparently not leaving, they began to approach. Some cautiously. Some with visible relief. A few with the slight shame of people who know they stayed quiet when they could have said something, and have had time to think about that. I didn't hold it against any of them. That's not useful. And it's not fair. Most of them were protecting themselves in a situation they had limited power over. I understood that. It didn't mean nothing, but it didn't change what mattered. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the company, and whether we could make it what it was supposed to be. My assistant found me there an hour later with a printed stack of meeting requests, an inbox summary, and a legal pad covered in notes. She set them on the table and sat down across from me with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Where do you want to start? She said. I looked at the stack. I picked up the legal pad. From the beginning, I said. 3 weeks later, the audit results were made available to shareholders in a formal filing. The numbers were worse in some places than I'd expected and better in others, which is the usual way of things when you start pulling on loose threads. The key finding, the $2 million transfer scheme, was confirmed and quantified. 2 additional irregularities were flagged that I hadn't known about, both traced to the same originating relationship. My former partner's attorney reached out 3 more times in that period. I let mine handle every communication. I had made my peace with that relationship. Or rather, I had accepted that there was no peace to make, only a clean accounting and a move forward. The man I had started this company with, the man I'd trusted through 8 years of building something from nothing, had looked at everything we'd made together and decided that consolidating his own position was worth more than the partnership that had produced it. I would spend a long time understanding that, maybe the rest of my life in the back of my thoughts on quiet evenings. But I would not spend it waiting for an apology that wouldn't come or a reckoning that wasn't mine to deliver. That was already handled. Olivia agreed to stay on as board chair through the restructuring period. Thomas took on an expanded governance role. We hired an independent compliance officer whose sole mandate was oversight with real authority. We rewrote the conflict of interest policy from scratch and made every senior executive sign it individually. We also launched a formal internal mentorship program, something I'd been wanting to do for 2 years, repeatedly deprioritized, for which I now suddenly had both the authority and the motivation. My brother had believed in building people up, not just building companies. I had let that principle get buried under the machinery of growth. I intended to unbury it. The blocked message never sent a second one. I'd half expected it. A follow-up threat, an escalation, some attempt to introduce new instability. But there was nothing. I think whoever sent it, whether my former partner directly or through an intermediary, had expected it to land differently, had expected fear or a defensive scramble, or some reaction that would give them something to work with. When there was no visible reaction, there was nothing to push against. Silence is its own kind of response. I've believed that for a long time. About a month after the reinstatement, on a Saturday morning when the office was empty, I went up to the 17th floor and stood at the window by myself for a while. The lake was gray that day, the sky low, the city doing what it does in November, enduring, steady, indifferent to individual stories. I thought about something my brother said to me once, a few years before he got sick, on a day when things were going badly and I was considering pulling back from a fight I wasn't sure I could win. He said, "The people who try to quietly take something from you are counting on you being too tired or too polite to go get it back. Don't be either." I wasn't tired. And I had never been particularly polite in the ways that matter. I had gone and gotten it back. That wasn't the end of the story. There would be a trial process. More documentation, months of legal machinery moving at the pace legal machinery always moves. There would be the ongoing work of stabilizing the company and rebuilding the relationships that had been frayed or broken. There would be quiet evenings where I would sit in the Wabash office and think about the version of my former partner I'd known in the early years, and feel something complicated that I did not yet have a clean name for. But the company was mine again. The work was mine again. And outside the gray November window, 14 floors below, the city moved forward the way it always does, without ceremony, without waiting, in the steady and total indifference of something very large that doesn't need your permission to continue. I picked up my coffee, turned away from the window, and went back to work.